the Executive Director of the National Center for Lesbian Rights, Kate Kendell.
It is so great to be here, and I guess I'm closing you out. So I'm the only thing standing between you and going to SeaWorld or whatever you've got on your agenda. But I'm really excited to be here, and I so appreciate it. It was Vinny who made this invitation to me. I will underscore his tenacity, because the invitation was like 2 years ago. Vinny and I were together at a fundraiser. This is so weird, the serendipity of this. We were together at a fundraiser. These are not circles we normally move in, but we happened to be together at a fundraiser at Ozzy and Sharon Osbourne's house. And I was there with my son, who was 13 at the time, is now 15. And I remember vividly, Vinny, we were standing by the pool area, meeting you, and you were talking about this conference, and he said, and I'd like you to, to be a part of it. And I said, well, I'd love to. When is it? And I thought he was going to say, like, oh, it's 2 months from now. And he said, oh, it's in 2012. And I thought, Jesus, that's like forever away. I'm sure that my schedule is clear and that I can participate. And here it is. And I'm so excited. And I'm here with the entire family. We actually are, in fact, going to SeaWorld this afternoon. And I know that you've had an amazing weekend, and that you've been, there are students here, there are teachers, there are educators, there are counselors, there are graduate students who are going to be counselors, there are staff from the National Center for Lesbian Rights who are here, who have been part of the program, talking about all sorts of things: legal issues, protecting kids when they come out, creating GSAs, creating a social justice framework and culture at your schools, a whole range of things. And I'm sure, and at least more than one occasion, each of you thinking about going back to your real lives, out of this bubble of security and acceptance, feels like what you've learned here and how you're going to transform it and how you're going to translate it when you go back home has felt a little daunted. Am I right? How am I going to make this happen? And, I think a lot about that in the work that we do at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. We're a legal organization, so we play mostly in the sandbox of the courts, but we also do a lot of policy work. We work with amazing people all over the country, like Pat Griffin, one of my personal heroes, who has done so much to change the landscape for LGBT athletes and for women in sports. And if I think too big about the culture that we want to change and the change that we need to make and what the opposition that we face, I'd be curled up in the fetal position. So, I take to heart the old adage that the longest journey begins with that first step. And so when you think about the first step, what I've been thinking about a lot lately is, really trying to answer the question, what kind of world do we want to live in? And what you've been talking about this weekend is, of course, a world where every single kid feels safe, free from stigma, loved for who he or she is, and embraced by his family, her community, her school. In order to make that vision happen, we really have to adopt something Daniel said in his remarks, where he said, no, where you don't remain silent. And how I've been thinking about this is it comes from a curriculum that my kids went through and my daughter is still going through. Now she's in 4th grade, my son's now in high school. It's a Don't Be a Bystander curriculum. And it really talks to these kids about, it kind of answers the question, what kind of world do you want to live in? Well, you want to live in a world where you don't ever pass by or step over if you should speak out or stand up. And when I think about my own life, the things that keep me awake at 3 o'clock in the morning, some of those things are when I didn't speak up when I wish that I would have, or I didn't act when I wish that I would have. And in the context that you're talking about here and that you've been talking about all weekend, of course, there's not one of you that would not do what this bus driver with Daniel refused to do. There's not one of you who would remain silent if a kid was called a racial slur or a sexual orientation slur or somebody used some sort of epithet against them. Every one of you would speak up on behalf of that student. But think about any other context where you might still be a bystander or not speak up. By doing that, you're sort of stepping back from the path of what kind of world do we want to live in, and from that journey that you're on to create a climate where all students are safe. Because we really want to think bigger than just that. That is, of course, what we want to do. But we really want to answer the question that everyone, no matter who they are, feels safe and secure and embraced. And it must mean that in no context can you be a bystander. When I was doing a little bit of research on being a bystander, I was kind of looking up the curriculum. I wanted to see, what is it that, because my kids were talking about it. And in fact, there was a story that I heard about from a parent of a friend of one of my son's friends, who they were at summer camp last year, and my son Julian is sort of a big kid, tall, kind of strong and big and for his age, and he has a little friend named Cole, much shorter than he is, very slight, really long blonde hair. He's a rocker, and they were at camp and they were sitting together, and some other kid walked by them and looked at Cole and said, "You look like a girl." And Julian stood up, and he ended up being 6 inches taller than this other kid. And Julian looked at Cole and he looked at the kid and he said, "That's my friend." And the kid who said it stepped back and said, "Oh gosh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean anything. I'm sorry." And of course, Julian didn't tell us about this. We heard about it from Cole's dad. But it was just a small little thing that made Cole in that moment not feel alone. This bystander effect, there is a thing called the bystander effect. It's been studied by sociologists and social psychologists. It grew out of the very brutal murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. I was 4 years old at the time, but I remember hearing about this story as I got older. And of course, there's some mythology surrounding the story that isn't really true. Kitty Genovese was murdered in Queens, New York, middle of the night on her way home from her job. Brutally, she was screaming. The press reports were that 38 people heard this and didn't do anything about it. And of course, it just reinforced this view that, oh my gosh, New York is such a brutal place, and how could this possibly happen? Well, that's not actually true. People did call the cops. One of Kitty's neighbors came down after the attack and actually held her until the fire department and police arrived. They were too late. Kitty died. I mean, clearly people could have done more. There's no doubt about that. But people did do something. The other thing that I never knew until I researched this some more is that Kitty Genovese was a lesbian and was living with her female partner at the time, who was still alive, now lives in Vermont and talks about what happened. But the bystander effect that they studied, the sociologists studied, that grew out of the Kitty Genovese murder is well documented. And it is absolutely the case that if something bad is happening, an altercation on a street corner, a bullying incident in a school, the more witnesses to it, the less likely someone is going to intervene. Everyone thinks someone else will do something. Or, it must not be that bad. Or maybe I didn't really hear right. Or maybe if I say something, I'll be the next target. Or maybe if I say something, my friends will make fun of me. Or maybe if I say something or get involved, some sort of harm could come to me. I mean, you never know what people might be thinking. But it is, if something bad is going to happen to you, hope that only one person sees it and is around, because you're much more likely to get help from that one person than from 20 people. The interesting serendipity of when you pay attention to an issue like this are that you see it around you all the time. I picked up my partner Sandy from work on BART, the public transportation in the Bay Area, last week, and she got in the car and I said, "How was your day?" And she said, "Well, my day was fine, but I just had a pretty intense experience on the BART train." And I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, I was sitting there on the train, minding my own business, as of course you do relentlessly when you're on public transportation, and all of a sudden I heard screaming. I heard a man's voice screaming, and he was clearly screaming at a woman. And I looked up, and I saw this whole phalanx of people coming away from where the incident was happening, moving away from the woman who was being screamed at by this man, standing over her with a small toddler crying next to her. Sandy got up and walked against the crowd. And I said, wow, I said, first of all, I can't believe that this is happening. You're telling me this story when I'm just in the middle of thinking about this issue, and that you would do that. And she said, well, it's my domestic violence training. I mean, I'm not going to go confront the guy. I'm not going to go, grab him and wrestle him to the ground. But what you're taught in domestic violence training is that that woman needs to know someone is witnessing what is happening, and that someone cares. And he needs to know that someone is standing there. All she did was stand there. But everyone else, the 25 people in a crowded BART train, walked away. I was lucky enough to be raised by a mother who was not a bystander, a devout Mormon. See all these themes? A devout Mormon who, from the time I came out to her in a moving vehicle, which seemed like a good idea at the time, I don't know why. I came out to her at 19, and I was very worried about this conversation because, we didn't talk about this issue in a Mormon household. And as soon as I told her, she could tell that I was scared and my voice was shaking. I think I was crying a little bit. And she reached over and she took my hand and she said, honey, the most important thing to me is that you are happy. And she never wavered from that. And I saw her again and again, whether it was, we lived in Ogden, Utah. It's not like we had a ton of tourists coming through Ogden, Utah. But occasionally, we would be walking down the street and, a woman would need help with a baby carriage that, wasn't rolling right, or something was wrong with it, or needed help going up the stairs. My mother unfailingly would be the first person to stop and help. Somebody needed directions, or somebody didn't look like they knew where they were going. Can I help you? Is there anything I can help you with? She was constantly not being a bystander and helping in any way she could. In the neighborhood, making meals for people who were sick, all of that. My mother had a stroke, a debilitating stroke, in 1993. And then she had another stroke in 2003. By this time, I had moved away from Utah and was living in the Bay Area. My sister calls me and says, you've got to get home right away. We don't know if Mom's going to make it. So I got on first plane, got home. I did make it, but then was there to witness my mother's, yet again, huge, difficult slog back to being able to communicate and take care of herself after a second debilitating stroke. And I was there one time about a month after the stroke, visiting her. She was in a rehabilitation facility next to the hospital, and her speech therapist came to take her for speech therapy. And the speech therapist was either a dyke or a Mormon housewife. It was impossible to tell. And it is true. Mormon, Wyoming, Idaho, you can't tell the women. Your gaydar will never work. It's like there's a thin line between the two. And so the woman came and took my mother to speech therapy. I came with her. And she was asking my mother what would normally be very simple questions to ask. How many kids do you have? There are 3 of us. Where do your children live? And then she says, what do your children do for a living? And, my mom really struggled to get this information and communicate it accurately, and was sort of in the ballpark with my brother and sister, but it was difficult to get the information. And then she turns to me, the speech therapist, and she says, well, Kathy's here. Well, my family calls me Kathy. Kathy's here from San Francisco. Why don't you tell me what Kathy does for a living? And I thought, well, this is going to be fascinating. And my mom looks at me, and she looks at the speech therapist, and she says, well, what Kathy does is very important. She takes care of all the lesbians and gays in the world. And I remember at that moment feeling so loved. The speech therapist turns to me and says, "Well, that's an awfully big job." And, you know, my mother died a year later. But I'll tell you what, from my earliest childhood, there was no doubt in my mind that I was unconditionally loved. And there was no doubt in my mind that my mother would be there for anyone who needed assistance or help. And that's my call to action, to honor her legacy. So the work that we do and that you do every day on behalf of LGBTQ or allied young people who, because they stand up for their LGBTQ friends, are taunted or harassed, is really the work of saving lives. It is the work of standing in for parents who may not be like my mom, who may be like Jody's parents right at the very beginning and then never move from that spot. And to have allies like Jody Huckabee and PFLAG doing the amazing work that we're doing and answering the question in a very fierce and flawless way. How do we want the world to be? Well, we want the world to be kick-ass for people who are different and who have been stigmatized or lack dignity in any way. We have just concluded, we're just on the brink of settling our lawsuit against the Anoka-Hennepin School District, a lawsuit that we have partnered with the Southern Poverty Law Center. The Anoka-Hennepin School District is part of Michelle Bachmann's House Congressional District. Yes, Spade Majors. Yes, my mother needs to talk to Michelle Bachmann. We are representing 6 kids in this school district. Ebony, Brittany, Dylan, Damon, Kyle, and a Jane Doe, all subjected to the kind of harassment and taunting that Daniel talked about, and so much more. In a school district where 7 kids in 2 years committed suicide, 4 of them gay or thought to be gay. A body count, and still the district clung to this policy that made it actually forced teachers to be bystanders. Because if they spoke up to defend LGBTQ young people, they would be accused of violating the district policy that said you can't say anything about homosexuality. A policy that acted as a muzzle on teachers to intervene on behalf of LGBT young people. Well, I am happy to report, it's amazing what good a lawsuit can sometimes do. The policy is gone. It is history. Kids are safer in the Anoka-Hennepin School District, and we are within a week or 2 of settling this lawsuit on behalf of our clients and every single student in the Anoka-Hennepin School District. Through a local homeless shelter or an LGBT organization, volunteer. You're asked and you have the means to financially support organizations doing social justice work to change the landscape in your community. Write the check. Don't be a bystander, because by not being a bystander, you will eventually realize broader goals and, for purposes of this weekend, the goals that this conference envisions. No more kids living in fear. No more lost kids. No more suffering. And no more bystanding. Thank you so much.